Today I have 5 new and easy DIYs using Dollar Tree skulls. For this one, I'm starting out with 2 different size wood circles. The smaller size is from Dollar Tree and the larger one's from Hobby Lobby, but you can see how rough and jagged the edges of these wood pieces are, and I want to stain them. So in order to get a nice, even and clean looking stain, you want to sand them down first. I have this square sheet palm sander that works great on things like this. Since the sheet of the sandpaper wraps around the front edge of the sander, I can easily get into the grooves of the circle and make sure it is all sanded nice and smooth. And I'm using a 220 grit sandpaper here. See how much better that looks? I always recommend to sand wood before you stain it, and you will get a much better result. I'm going to use the color Early American, and I gave all 4 wood circles 1 coat. Now for the skulls, I'm using 5 of the larger plastic skulls from Dollar Tree, and first I'm going to give the surface a scuff sand. I'm going to spray paint these ones, and I don't want the paint to just scratch right off. You just need to rough up that surface a little bit, don't go crazy here. I'm using a 100 grit sandpaper. I want to stack the skulls to make 2 staggered pillars. The first skull will sit on the larger wood circle as the base, and for the larger one, I'm using 3 skulls. I want them all to be facing a different direction so it looks a little bit twisted. So to stack the skulls and hold them in place, I'm using a dowel. Here I'm showing a very thin dowel, but I would recommend something much thicker. My pillars are pretty wobbly, and I went back later to add a thicker one, which you'll see here shortly. I added a generous amount of hot glue between the skulls to hold them in place, and then it's time to spray paint. I'm using a flat black spray paint as the primer, and then I'm going in with Oil Rub Bronze by Behr spray paint. And you can see my struggles here. The skulls are so light that the force of the spray paint is knocking them right over. I ended up getting some double-sided tape to hold them down while I painted. Once the spray paint was dry, I'm going to glue the skull down to the wood base. I wanted the glue to dry quickly so I could keep working, but didn't only want to use hot glue. So I'm using E6000 as well as the hot glue. That way I get a stronger, long-lasting hold with the E6000, and you'll notice I am not mixing the glues together. You want to keep them separate for the best adhesion. For the top, I'm using the smaller wood round circle, but there's a bump on the top of the skull and it's not going to sit right. So I got out my hot knife and I cut a circle out on the top of the head so that it sits better. I did have to keep playing around with it to get it as level as I could, but once I did get it as level as I could, I'm using the E6000 and hot glue again to attach the smaller wood circle to the top of the pillar. And then I did the same process for the second skull pillar. So once I had it all together, I put a candle on top and realized just how wobbly it was. So I grabbed a much thicker dowel to swap out for that smaller one. Good thing I had only used hot glue here and it pulled right apart. So I cut my dowel down and I also made it a little bit taller this time to make sure that it goes all the way through to the top of the top skull for full stability. I put a generous amount of hot glue on the bottom of the dowel as well to hold it in place on the bottom, and then stacked my skulls back on top. I also added a healthy portion of hot glue in between each layer, making sure both the dowel and the skull were adhered together. This time it is much sturdier. I've even seen people use metal paper towel holders from the Dollar Tree as a support, but that's it for this one. You could use them as a pillar candle holder, plant stand, or even put little jars of candy on top for Halloween. This project is super easy, definitely the easiest one today. I picked up a pack of these little skull buckets from the Dollar Tree, and first I'm going to remove that handle on them. I'm going to make a set of ombre succulent planters, and they turned out so freaking adorable. I love them. The base color is going to be this terracotta paint by Folk Art in the color Pueblo. You can make this paint yourself by just adding some baking soda to it, and then you can use any color you choose. So the darkest skull is going to be the paint on its own. Then for the rest of the skulls, I added more and more white paint to lighten it. You'll see 2 skulls are painted with the full saturated color at first. At first I was going to do something different, so for the next color I did about 3/4 Pueblo, 1/4 white, then 50-50, and then 25-75. I also added in some baking soda as I added in more white so I didn't lose that texture. I put 3 coats of paint on in total, and for the last coat I stippled it on to make sure that you could see that terracotta or baking soda texture. Next, I went to Home Depot to pick up some mini succulents, and first off, they don't have a great selection this time of year when it's starting to get cold out, but I also find that Lowe's has a much better plant selection overall. I just happened to already be at Home Depot, but anyways, I found this cute succulent garden with a few different varieties and thought it was perfect for my little planters. I filled up the skulls about halfway with soil and then pulled the succulent garden apart to separate each plant, and then I placed one in each of my skulls. For this project, I picked up a frame from my local thrift store, and I wanted a more ornate frame with some detail around it. I also like the shape of this one since it wasn't the usual square or rectangle. First thing I did was remove the screws in the backing and then clean up the glass and remove any dirt and fingerprints. I want to turn this clear glass into a vintage mirror, and to do that, I'm going to use a few different spray paints, with the main one being this mirror effect. The antique brass and oil rub bronze will be an accent and help with the aged look. And the spray bottle contains a bleach water mixture. I'm using the bleach to spritz on the glass before adding any of the spray paints. This is going to give that mercury glass or aged glass look since the spray paint won't stick where the bleach water is. It's hard to tell what I'm doing here, but I held the sprayer pretty high up to get larger droplets. Then I'm going to use the mirror effect spray paint, and when using this spray paint, you want to shake it really well, even more than you would shake any other spray paint. and then apply a thin coat over the glass. You want to overlap the rose slightly and then let it dry for 1 minute. It's going to look pretty streaky at this point, but that's okay. I'm going to repeat this 5 times. After the third coat, I blotted up the water, and you don't want to wipe here, just pat or you will end up lifting up that spray paint entirely. You want it to look like holes in the mirror. I added the fourth coat of the mirror effect without any bleach water on the surface, and then once that dried, I spritzed on some more of the bleach water. And this time I also added on the antique brass spray paint, just very lightly misting it over the mirror. I don't want it to be super prominent, but it will be visible through the holes we created earlier. I blotted the spray paint off right away and it started to take all of the layers of paint off with it. That wasn't exactly what I had wanted to happen, but we still have one more coat of the mirror effect to add on. So I did that, and this time while it was still wet, I added the oil rub bronze around the edges for more of an old world vintage look. Now for the frame, of course I wasn't recording like I thought I was, but I had spray painted the whole thing in flat black. I want the details of the frame to show through, so I'm adding some rub and buff to the raised areas. I'm using the color European Gold and a fluffy makeup brush to apply it. I had accidentally got some of the rub and buff on the black paint where I didn't want it. Since this is a spray paint, I just sprayed a tiny bit into a cup and painted it on to touch up those spots. Now I can put the mirror back into the frame. For the skull, I got this one from Michael's. I wanted a larger one for this project, and I also wanted the jaw to open and close, but I'm gonna need to cut the back of his skull off a little bit. I want it to look like it's coming through the mirror. So I drew a line where I wanted to cut it, and then I cut it off with my hot knife again. I cut it a little bit too straight and should have probably cut it at an angle, but it's okay, it still works out. I'm attaching the skull to the mirror with my super glue and accelerator. The skull was looking a little bit too new and white, and I wanted to make it look more aged. So I'm using a makeup sponge and brown paint to add all over the skull, and then I'm wiping it back with a half-dry baby wipe. I went back and forth doing this technique until I was happy with how aged it was looking. I was gonna just leave the skull popping out, but decided to add in some hands as well. I made the skeleton hand crystal ball last year for Halloween and removed the hands to use them for this project. This time I added them with the super glue, but then also went around them with hot glue to keep them in the position that I wanted. They were a little bit top heavy with just the super glue. When I put the hands on upside down, I didn't even realize this until my husband had pointed it out, but I didn't want to fix it, so let's just ignore that part. Next, I'm using some creepy cloth to cover the skeleton and look like it's pulling through the cloth. At first I left it just wrapped over him like this, but when I looked back at some of my inspiration images, they had more of the skull through the creepy cloth, and the cloth looked like it was stretching from him breaking through it. So I went back and cut small pieces of the creepy cloth to glue onto the skull's face and stretch them onto the mirror. And I think this looks a lot better. I'm taking another one of the Dollar Tree skulls and first going to spray paint it white. And for this one, I want to make it look like there is a geode on the one side of the skull. So I drew out the shape that I wanted and used my hot knife to cut it out. This part ended up not being necessary, which you'll see here shortly. So to fill the hollow portion, I stuffed some plastic bags inside, and then I cut out a moss sheet to be the same size as that hole that I had cut out. Now this is where I messed it up, because a geode is supposed to look like it's coming out from within the skull, and I forgot to make it look like that. So I should have glued two pieces inward at an angle, so I really didn't even need to cut the pieces out at all because it is just flat, just like it was before. It's okay though, it still turned out super cute. Next, I painted the moss sheet white because I wanted to use clear geodes. I got these geodes from Amazon and I'll link them down in my favorites in the description box. They're basically little glass pieces. Some have white on the back, some are completely clear, and some have a mirror reflective surface on them. But I added a line of hot glue and then sprinkled the geodes over it and pushed them down into the surface, and I covered that whole moss section. Then I wanted to add some dimension to it, so I got out my tiny glass glitter and vintage gold to go around it. And this time I used my detail tip hot glue gun to get a smaller, thinner line, and I used a palette knife to direct the gold pieces into the glue. You want to have a plate underneath of your project when doing something like this so you don't lose all of that glitter that falls off and doesn't stick. And then you can just funnel it back into the jar. Lastly for this guy, or maybe this one should be a gal, but I added a pearl bead into the eye socket. I feel like it needs something a little bit more. It's kind of plain, but still looks cute. This project turned out to be such a mess, and I had some learnings along the way, but we'll get into that. If you are someone that doesn't like to see my mistakes, you can go ahead and skip this one. I'm taking this hexagon planter that I got from Dollar Tree a while ago. I'm not sure if they still sell this shape, but any bucket or planter would work. I'm gonna fill the bottom with plastic bags. I wanted to make a fire pit of burning skulls, and I've seen people do this on a much larger scale. They use this spray foam to fill in the fire pit and make it look like the coals. I've never used this before, so it was certainly a learning curve. First off, I filled the planter too high with the plastic bags. I knew this foam expanded, but didn't realize just how much it expands. It is also way stickier than I had ever imagined, but I covered the top with the foam and tried not to make it look uniform. Here's what it was looking like. I was hoping I could take it off to spray paint it and make it actually look like the fire coals, and then cut out sections to add the skulls in, but it wasn't going to work that way, especially because I realized after that I forgot a key component. So I scraped the foam out and started over. I was missing orange string lights to put in between the foam. This is what will make the coals look like they are glowing or burning. So unfortunately, my Dollar Tree was out of the battery-operated orange fairy lights, but I found this small 20 light strand that plugs in from the Dollar Tree Plus section. Since this is a plug-in, I wanted to cover up the end of the outlet that would be inside of the foam so that the foam doesn't get inside of it and ruin the lights. So I used electrical tape to cover it up. This time I put about half the lights into the planter and then added a layer of the foam, and then I added the rest of the lights and more foam. And with the second layer, I started adding in the skulls and skeleton bones that I had. But as I was doing this, I was trying to think about how I would paint the foam to look like coals without completely covering the skulls and the bones as well. So I panicked and I started pulling all the skeleton pieces out of the foam. I wasn't even recording at this point and my hands were completely covered in spray foam. So my husband picked up the camera to record me. This was such a bad idea, you guys. I was a mess. My craft table was a mess. Everything was a mess. I was panicking because I didn't think there was enough foam. It was sinking into the planter, and then I thought the lights were covered too much that you wouldn't even see them glowing. I was in full-on panic mode. I am still peeling sticky foam off of my skin. This was an absolute nightmare. But here's how it was looking the next day after I let it dry. I think the skulls look pretty cool because the foam that was on them ended up puffing up. I took it out to the garage to spray paint it now, and I started dabbing red paint all over to look like blood. Then mostly used the spray paint Burnished Amber by Behr. I misted the spray paint on so that it was a light coverage and didn't completely cover up the red paint. It's hard to tell on camera, but the Burnished Amber deepens that red paint and really does look like blood in there, and I love it. I layered up the red and the amber until I liked how that looked, and then I did a similar technique to the skulls. But this time I wanted it to look like the smoke was rising and slowly engulfing the skulls. So I was spraying them in an upward motion from the jawline. Once the paint dried, I piled everything into the planter, and then I added a few extra pieces of the foam that I had painted in the same way to look like it was coming up over the top. This project is not my favorite from today. I thought it was going to turn out so different, but I have some other ideas I want to try using the spray foam, so hopefully I can figure it out for the next one.